Okay, so we are very pleased to host today our guest, Oded Revivi, who is a lawyer and who's the mayor of Efrat and the chief foreign envoy for Yesha Council. He's living in Efrat since '94. I understand you all got his both speakers' CV, so I'm skipping some of the items.
You can repeat the positive parts.
Of yours.
Only of yours.
Okay, only of yours. Was very active in Efrat, promoting, enhancing social and physical and cultural projects. There also served in the military as a lieutenant colonel in the Armor Corps, and his regiment got the President's Prize for Excellence. Amir Oren writes for Haaretz, has been writing, I believe, almost half a decade.
Half a century.
Half a century, sorry. Yeah, that's it. Wrote about the security services, the Mossad, IDF, and others. He's a columnist for Haaretz. And the topic today is implications or ramifications of the UN Security Council resolution concerning settlements. But if you want to say something about journalism today in Israel, I'm sure people will be interested to know. So let's start with you, Oded. Tell us what is your take on the recent resolution?
The resolution is definitely very straightforward. I think you can't say that it can be interpreted in two different ways, that you can read one thing and understand another thing. I think if you're a reasonable person that understands what you read, it's quite straightforward. I think we need to look a bit in a broader picture and understand a few things in the background and maybe try and understand where we are at the moment. The first thing, it's a declaration. It's not something which has any operative implications. It's purely a declaration. I treat it as a yellow card taken out to the State of Israel, which means that we can't ignore and we can't dismiss and we can't say we're not seeing the international community at all. But on the other hand, we have to remember that there were also some things in the background. Number one, the fact that Egypt was the initial country who initiated the resolution and then went back, and in the 90th minute, as we would say in a soccer game, the replacement team went on, or the replacement players came onto the field and decided to bring it to the table for a vote. It's something which needs to be examined and the implications need to be understood and maybe learned a lesson from it. The other thing is that it was legislated under Chapter 7 and not Chapter 6, which again has the difference between the declaration and the physical sanctions. If it would have wanted, if the countries and if the United Nations wanted to do it as something which is more powerful, they would have taken out the other chapter, which would have been a much more problematic situation for the State of Israel. Taking all that into account, as I said, I see it as a yellow card, and for those of you who play soccer or football, depends from which part of the world you come from, you know that once you get one, you're in a danger of getting a second yellow card, and then you get a red card, which basically means you're off the pitch. And that's where I see it at the moment.
Wait a minute, you're talking, I thought you would say this. No, okay.
No, this is his cool analysis. Has nothing to do with what he wishes would happen, and that's fine. One has to assess the situation in order to try and shape policy later.
So what's your assessment?
Well, one has to go back even more than Oded just did, if you bear with me. Right after the Six-Day War in 1967, this was actually January of '68, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, who was the winning Prime Minister of the Six-Day War, went to see Lyndon Johnson at the LBJ range in Texas. And he came with several requests, mostly the Phantom F-4 fighter plane. You know that Oded Revivi was a colonel in the Israeli Air Force, a navigator, and the F-4 was the F-35 of the day. It was a coveted plane. Once Israel got it, it reflected its superiority in the air, which was very important for Israel. And this was what Eshkol really wanted. And he told Johnson, we need it in order to protect Israel. And Johnson asked him, when you say Israel, what do you mean? What kind of Israel do you want? And this has been the mainstay of American policy ever since. Do you mean the Israel of the 1949 armistice lines, which prevailed until June either 5th or 10th, depending on the area, 1967? Or do you mean Israel proper, as recognized by the United Nations and many nations, although not the Arab countries until Jordan and Egypt signed peace with Israel, Israel proper plus the occupied territories, which at that time meant the Sinai, the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. Now, as you know, for the last 49 years, there have been two areas, East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, which have been, to one extent or another, annexed by Israel. The other held their status still in a bind. It's pending until peace agreements would decide the issue. Now, let me jump to a year before Oded got to Efrat, 1993, the Oslo agreements. The main clause of the Oslo agreement was freezing the situation. Neither Israel nor the Palestine Liberation Organization, as the representative agency for the Palestinians, could jump over the gap and get to a peace agreement. And therefore, both sides, Rabin and Arafat, agreed that they have to take an interim step, hoping that during the 5 years of the interim period, the peoples on both sides would learn to know each other and therefore learn to love each other. Of course, it was the other way around, but let's not jump to the epilogue. But one important clause was that neither side is going to change the reality on the ground in order to prejudge the outcome of the negotiations. On the Palestinian side, it was a promise to cease and desist from all violence, not only from Arafat's own organization, Fatah, but also that he would have to impose his authority on Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and all the rest. And on the Israeli side, even though it was not put down in paper, the expectation was that the settlement activity, as it prevailed until the 93 Oslo agreements or the 1994 Cairo agreement, would not be changed materially.
Let's jump to today.
Neither expectation, of course, came into fruition. So what has happened was that the Palestinian violence changed Israeli behavior, Israeli attitudes, and we got to the terrible situation where we are with terror all over, not only here in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, but also within Israeli cities and towns. And the settlements, especially those over the last 23 years or so, have made the possibility, the viability of creating a Palestinian state, which is the avowed policy of the US administration since George W. Bush was president. Actually, it was right after the Israeli Defense Forces entered Jenin Israel had a distinct military achievement in 2002, but right after it, it suffered a political defeat because the American administration decided to come out for a Palestinian state. Now, if you have too many settlements, too many settlers, there is no viable solution because no Israeli government, in practical terms, would be able to evacuate enough settlers and settlements to enable a moderate Palestinian leadership present a case for an arrangement.
So the settlements are accomplished facts.
Now,
What is the implication of?
Okay, not only that, but in certain areas, of course, the bypass for that would be to swap territories. Okay, so why should we care? We have settlements in certain areas. Israel would give vacant areas in other places to the Palestinians. But in certain places, like Ma'ale Adumim, between Judea and Samaria, if there are too many Israeli settlements, it would...
How many is too many?
Enough to interfere with the contiguity of Judea and Samaria. If you have two separate cantons, along with Gaza, which is already separate, you can't have it. And this is what the Americans, not only under Obama, have tried to interfere with, and they failed because diplomacy failed.
Okay.
What's the question?
No, how many is too many? And what was the, how did the citizens of Efrat receive this resolution?
So I think the major or the concise answer to what you've asked is that without a clear policy, there's a reality. And in that respect, I agree with Amir. Both parties are in a chase of time to change the reality. And there's no clear policy which is governing, which is indicating as to where we want to go. And a period of 49 years, almost 50 years, might be a short term in 1,000 years of history. It's almost a lifetime in the history of the state of Israel. Because you have to remember, Israel is just 19 years old. Okay? It's not much of a significance already. It's between 50 years to 68, 69 years. And I think Amir in his analysis is right. Both parties were doing a lot to create a reality, and both sides took an equal part in creating the reality. The thing which I disagree with Amir, and that is a fact which is hidden, is not talked about, is not well known, is the fact that 84% of the Jewish population in Judea and Samaria actually live west of the security fence. So the fear that the Americans, the United Nations, some of Amir friends fear that it's already too late to create a Palestinian state, I haven't reached that stage yet.
Are you for a Palestinian state?
I think that in the last 49 years, we've devoted too much time in asking ourselves, are we for a one state or for a two state? I think that the main people who suffered from that reality are the private citizens on the ground level, because all the attention, all the devotion, all the funds were to determine which one of these two options we want. I think today it's clear that neither one of these options are something which are practical, you could even say. I can't even say that one is preferred on the other. I think both of them are being advocated by politicians who like to create headlines and don't like to provide answers for very hard questions regarding the two options. The one state option has an issue of the demography, the Jewish majority, which people are ignoring and not addressing, and the fear of becoming an apartheid state. And the two-state solution have financial issues, have the fact that since 1993, 1994, the Palestinian Authority was the attempt to establish a Palestinian state, And the reality today is it's a corrupt organization which is bankrupt, which is relying on foreign aid and not being able to pay and look after its own citizens. So I think that's where we are.
Is there a third option, or we just leave it like that?
No, we don't leave it like that. I think we need to come up with a third option. I think we need to sit and think and think and think. I'm telling you that I'm losing hours of sleep over trying to think of something. I can also tell you that when I'll have an option, I won't have time to come to the Jerusalem Press Club. I'll be running for the Prime Minister of the State of Israel. Because honestly, it's not a joke. I think that if we look left and right today in the political arena, there is not one leader who has a practical solution, a practical plan that I can say, this is the one we need to bet on at the moment.
Amir.
You know, President Reagan, who had a very good sense of humor, was asked once about the Arab-Israeli conflict, and he said, yes, the Middle East is a very tough problem which makes me lose sleep during my afternoon nap. Now, obviously, it has defied solutions, and here we are sitting with the late Prime Minister Rabin pictured here on the wall, and I'm reminded of a trip you, Uri, took along with myself and others with Rabin to China, Indonesia, Singapore, and Nairobi, and the peculiar character. Yes, we
same trip.
Yes.
Yeah.
The peculiar characteristic of it was that it took place in October of 1993, right after the Oslo Agreement was signed on the White House lawn. But both Arafat and Rabin had different interpretations to it, and they both ran around to meet with world leaders and sell them on their version of what they just signed. There was no agreement even when the agreement was signed. And you and myself, we all talk about the Palestinian state or not. First, there was the Jordanian option. One should be reminded, and of course there are veteran correspondents here, but one should be reminded that the Israeli mindset after 1967 was that what happened in 1948-49 and 1956 would be repeated. That is, Israel would be driven out of the territories which it took, northern Sinai in 1948 and Sinai and Gaza in 1956. And the only question was, are these territories going to be bargaining chips for security? And this has been the long-standing Israeli policy, and as long as there was an Israeli government ready for an agreement along the lines of United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, territory for peace, as long as there was an Israeli government ready for that, the onus was on the other side. The problem starts when an Israeli government does not look serious enough in its efforts to find a solution, because a solution must be found, because here we are, 8 million Israelis, who knows, between 4 and 5 million Palestinians. How many more millions can be crowded into this territory? And this is even before one begins to speak about the refugees or the grandchildren of the refugees who would come back to the Palestinian state. They were not going to come in great numbers to Israel proper, but they would come here. So a practical solution, economically, socially, water, infrastructure, what have you, must be found. And if you have, remember, the resolution only talks about freezing the settlement, not evacuating even one settler from one settlement, only freezing the settlement activity, which is what President Obama tried during his first year in office, with the agreement of Prime Minister Netanyahu, who was in principle against it, but had to accept it. So why can't the settlement movement accept that for the duration of the negotiations, there will be a freeze on settlement? Nobody tells them, pack up your bags and go leave now. Just don't get more people into the settlement.
What about natural growth?
Is it really natural? You know, while we are sitting here, some other people are. No,
He's the mayor of Efrat.
But you know, this has been a pretext, natural growth, and then you say that the second generation wants to build their homes there, so they marry, and lo and behold, there is more natural growth. And while we are speaking here, they are over there in their bedrooms or wherever, working on the third generation.
I'll tell you where I disagree with Amir. I think the changing point wasn't with the Israeli government's policies regarding what is the status of these areas which were conquered, released, you say whichever political form you want, of these areas after the 1967 war. But basically Egypt was the one who changed the equation. If we thought that we had bargaining cards that were worth something, all of a sudden with the peace agreement with Egypt, we were left with Gaza, which became a worthless card. We thought it was a card that was going to fit in the equation of land for peace, and all of a sudden they're saying to us, we'll give you peace, we're not interested in that card. With Jordan, things become even more complicated, where they don't want not Judea, they don't want Samaria, they don't want El-Quds, they don't want East Jerusalem. They're saying, we'll provide peace, you just provide us with the Jordan River's water, you protect our border from the Palestinians, and again, we're stuck with irrelevant cards in our hand. But the truth of the matter needs to be said that during the term of President Obama, and I'm saying to you this as somebody who's met Prime Minister Netanyahu during this term quite a few times and quite frequently, the fear, which he repeated afterwards on record, of not one more brick is actually taking place. Most of the cities, towns in Judea and Samaria are under a freeze as long as the government can enforce it. What do I mean by as long as the government can enforce it? We have to remember that after the understanding with President Bush, the Israeli government changed the whole policy. In the past, there were reductions in income tax. There was a 7% reduction of income tax that people who lived in Judea and Samaria were entitled for. It was cancelled. There were loans that turned into grant. They were cancelled. There were mortgages in better rates. They were cancelled. All the financial implications were cancelled. And all that to comply with the request of not encouraging people to actually move over.
May I interrupt for a moment? Why are you entitled to the deduction which I in Tel Aviv?
I didn't say I was. I just said that I was describing the reality.
I didn't make sushi bar next to you.
I didn't make. That's a good excuse. I'll use it for next time you ask me.
No, by that time there will be a sushi bar in Efrat.
There is already one, but we'll think of something else. But the encouragement of the state of Israel literally stopped. Okay, so people, when President Obama comes into office and he says, I don't understand. I thought there was an understanding with the American administration of not encouraging Jewish people to cross over the Green Line. And all of a sudden I'm confronted with a reality that the population between Bush and my coming into office grew by 150,000 people. And the answer is that, again, there was no clear policy. The Americans didn't quite understand that not all the building is taking place through the Israeli government. It was taking place either on private land or with Jewish, the Jewish agency land that was owned by them, that the government didn't actually need to be involved. Today, if you speak with any mayor in Judea and Samaria, they will all be complaining, rightfully, that none of the plans are being promoted, that nothing is being done in order to even answer the right of natural growth. And it is turning, that's why there's so much pressure on Netanyahu from the right hand. If there would have been planning, if there would have been building, if there would have been marketing, there wouldn't have been so much pressure. And that's where Netanyahu is. And if you ask me, the biggest challenge that Netanyahu is facing now, after the 20th of January...
Apart from the other...
I'm not dealing with that, but regarding what we know in this room after the 20th of January, is that the excuse of not one more brick seems to have disappeared. So and now the question will be, how will Netanyahu act in that reality?
So let's talk about how was the election of Trump received in Efrat. So from now on, it will be a carte blanche for...
I'll tell you, Trump, we knew that he won, I think it was like Tuesday night, and Wednesday morning I get a call that I have to come to an emergency meeting in the Knesset. The lobby for ArabIsraeli is gathering and everybody needs to come. So I came and everybody from the right wing was almost having a hangover party celebrating the victory. I was one of the few, also the member of Knesset, Yehuda Glick, said, guys, we don't know who this Trump is, we don't know what he's bringing with him, let's wait and see, and we also have another 2 months until he actually goes into the White House. So to answer your question, yes, people opened bottles of champagne. If you ask me, I think it's very early to open bottles of champagne. It's very hard to predict what will he bring with him. And again, I'm not looking across the ocean to find the answers. I think the election of Trump is putting Prime Minister Netanyahu on the spot, that maybe for the first time in many years he will have to say what is his policy, because he might be surprised with an American ambassador who is more right-wing than him. He might be surprised with an American president who says to him, listen, I couldn't care less what you do in your country, you just sort out things with yourself, and just phone me in case there's a crisis, but otherwise I don't want to get to interfere. That's the attitude that a business person takes. He gets involved in businesses that he sees that he can break a deal, and not where he gets into a bankruptcy or into a long legal process.
When one goes into the diplomatic history of all the US administrations since 1967, and sometimes even before that, there is one term which is repeated, and this is even-handedness. All American administrations at least strived, always achieved, strived for a balanced approach, what they considered balanced approach to the Arabs, now it is more Palestinians, but to the Arabs in general and the Israelis, for various reasons, strategic, emotional, oil, Cold War when it was still there. And the Trump administration with Tillerson as Secretary of State and others is not going to be any different, especially, as Oded said, Donald Trump prides himself on being the master of the art of the deal. A deal can only be reached if both sides see their interest, a win-win situation, and if one can offer incentives to each side. Now, his position on Israel is well known. This, of course, makes him a bit defensive vis-à-vis the Palestinians. He must offer them something else in order to reach a deal. And this something else will, one could add, hopefully, be taken from the account.
By some.
Yes, that Oded and his friends are keeping. Now, one should mention that we are here positioned because Uri asked us to have a conflict in order for the chat to be
I'm trying, I'm doing my best.
Yes, no, but you see, and we are labeled as right-wing versus left-wing. Actually, we are all driving down the same highway. Perhaps this is the right lane and the left lane, but we are still on the same highway. And on the margins, you have people on the extreme right and the extreme left with other solutions which are outside of the mainstream. But the real problem for Israel, and this is what Trump is going to find out, for Israel as well as for the Palestinians and others, is that in the Middle East there are moderate majorities. Moderate majorities, militant minorities. Right. The problem is that moderate majorities are moderate in their means, not only in their ends. And they are not imposing their will on the militant minorities which are willing to use violence in order to achieve their ends. If there is a deal, the broad outlines of the deal are apparent. If there is a deal, people who live in Efrat, such as Oded, and people who live in Tel Aviv, not only journalists, because I'm only expressing my opinions, but also the great majority of people who, you know, if you go into a living room in Tel Aviv, 4 people look at each other and say, how come Meretz didn't win the elections? We all voted for it. Who else is there? So people in Tel Aviv as well as in Efrat can agree on a solution, and there will not be a civil war if it is dependent on them. But there are extremists, and they can cause a flare-up. And the question is, will there be bold leadership here, bold political leadership with political will to try and impose order on the situation if a solution is suggested by a Trump administration or by some successive administration, and the Israeli government, painfully as it will see the situation, accepts it.
Are you sure about your description of minorities and majorities? Because my feeling is that in Israel today, more people support what you call minority, but it might be a majority.
If you look at the numbers, people who live east of the Green Line or the security fence are a small minority, less than 10% of Israelis. And if it was only left to them, the other 90% would rule. Of course, they have many more supporters on this side of the line, and I don't know why you mentioned the security fence, because nobody has yet agreed that this is going to be the border. Of course, when it was suggested to Prime Minister Sharon, he didn't want it because he said this will be the outer limit of our expansion, while others saw it as too much of an expansion, and for the last 12 or 13 years it has been the marker for the reality. But if you look at views rather than at people living wherever they are, I think you're right. Many more people are moving to the right, if one could analyze it superficially. You could have seen it in the public opinion polls following the sentencing or the conviction of Sergeant Azaria. You had 70% supporting him against some 30% who thought that the court was right. And this is not Israel versus the Palestinians. This is the military, including the court, including the Israeli Defense Forces Chief of Staff. And Oded, you were a military officer as well as you. You know that the Israeli Defense Forces makes a real effort to stay out of politics, especially as it pertains to its military justice system. Nevertheless, there is a growing gap within the Israeli society between quote-unquote right and left. What will happen once a certain policy is presented and one will have to disengage the way Sharon did from Gaza, or Begin and Sharon from the Sinai area, Yamit and Sharm el-Sheikh? It remains to be seen, but it seems as if resistance will stiffen as time goes by.
Let's open up, okay, for questions, comments. Elias?
Yeah, good afternoon.
Hi, Elias. How are you?
I haven't. In fact, I want to be a little bit unpopular among Palestinians and suggest something or possibly try to trigger a different paradigm of the discussion. I think, first of all, I cannot blame the settlers, i.e. settlers, for being where they are not supposed to be, because it is, first and foremost of all, the responsibility of all the Israeli governments since '68 when they started this enterprise until today. And it is the duty and the responsibility of the Israeli government, today we're talking about the incumbent government, to do or correct or repair or whatever you want to call it, the damage that was caused after 67 or 68. But it was known from the beginning, and you come from Haaretz, and you know the two reports that came out in Haaretz last year, about 6 or 7 months ago, about two very important documents that were sent, one in September 1967, three months after the war, by Yaakov Herzog, who was Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister's office of Levi Eshkol, and he sent that letter to the legal consultant or legal advisor of the Foreign Ministry, asking about the status of the occupied territories and asking if Israel, as the occupying power, can destroy houses of Palestinians or deport these Palestinians who allegedly carry out terror attacks or so on, or fight Israelis. And the answer was very clear. The answer said that under the Geneva Convention, the fourth convention, Israel is not allowed to do so because we are the occupying power. 6 months later, in March '68, another letter was sent by the same person to the same person, asking if Israel can move part of its citizens, part of its population, into settlements that it plans to build in the occupied territories. And the answer was very clear. Again, no, this is all under international law, is illegal. And it even explained that one of the reasons the fourth Geneva Convention was written is solely to defend, to protect the rights of the population that comes under occupation, because the government, the army of the country that loses the war is incapable of protecting its own citizens, and someone has to worry about protecting them. And a week later, the government met the cabinet met, and they decided, okay, Geneva Convention applies to occupied territories, we're not gonna call them occupied territories, we'll change the name. And they started calling them administered territories, or in Hebrew, Shtachim Murzakim. And that is exactly, that's where it started. From the beginning, it was very clear to every official in the Israeli governments, from then until today, that everything, every move that was done beyond the Green Line was illegal under international law. Yeah. You spoke about some limitations by the government on one hand, but on the other hand, the government has turned a blind eye to whatever the settlers could do using the agency.
So the point is that settlements are illegal?
No, the point is, first of all, settlements are illegal. The second point is, if I want to look at it, and this is something a little bit unpopular, if I want to look at it from a humanitarian point of view, I strongly believe that it is the full right of every settler to demand whatever compensation they see fit from the Israeli government that sent them there from the beginning. What more important is, you said that there hasn't been any plan to solve this issue of the settlements, but I think I was at the Haaretz conference almost 2 years ago in Tel Aviv, and right after I spoke, there was another session where Amir Oren presented his plan, and his plan is a roadmap to how to solve the issue of settlements, talking about 80%, something like 80% of the settlers remaining where they are.
Will you accept it? Will you accept that 80% in the blocks remain there?
In part of the land swap, yes, of course. I mean, I told Amir the minute he finished, I said, you know what? Listening to what you said, 90% of what you said is acceptable without even negotiating.
But in those blocks where 80% live, do you mind that it is not frozen and that more settlers go there?
No, that's a different issue. Now, the difference between this is that we know what the parameters of the agreement are. The question is, what? The problem, not the question. The problem is Israel believed that because the Palestinians back in 2001 in Kaaba negotiations accepted the notion of a land swap. At that time, it was 1.7% of the West Bank area. So in this case, we can go ahead and build and build and build and build. Abbas' approach and Hillary Clinton's approach when she became Secretary of State was that, okay, let's define where the borders will be between the two states, and then whatever is going to remain under Israeli control, Israel will have the freedom to build without any settlement fees. But Israel never accepted neither this or nor that. I have so many other things, but
but
I give the floor for others.
Put a question mark here. Okay. You want to comment on this?
Yes. While I sympathize with your point of view regarding the settlements, one should remember...
This is the accusation of Haaretz, always sympathizing with the Palestinians.
Yes, but you know that if I start a sentence like that, what will follow will not be so palatable.
After the honey
After
will come the vinegar. Okay.
You know that there are always several baskets at the nothing is ever agreed upon unless and until everything is agreed upon. And you have the settlements basket, you have security, you have borders, you have Jerusalem, you have refugees. And you cannot isolate one point. For me, for myself, my own private view, this has not changed. 242, territories for peace, with security, the militarized zones. I thought that the Jordanian option was better, that Israel was wrong after 1973 not to reach an interim agreement with Jordan the way it did with Syria and Egypt and move towards peace. And if you have a confederation between Amman and Bethlehem or Amman and East Jerusalem, it's fine, it's your business. But this is...
Paris tried in the 87.
You know, I should tell you about it. In 1985, this was the 40th anniversary of the United Nations, and here we are talking about UN resolutions. Paris was in New York. There was a permanent representative of the Israeli government to the United Nations, one Benjamin Netanyahu, but Paris was in New York in order to meet with either King Hussein or his representative Adnan Abu Hodeh. And here we are. Elias is strikingly similar in look to Crown Prince Hassan, right, of Jordan.
But I wasn't there.
Yeah, you weren't there. And what transpired, General Abraham Tamir Abrasha was the emissary for Paris. Adnan Abu Hodeh the Minister of Court was the emissary for Hussein, and the message was Peres, as people here may remember, headed a coalition government with Shamir, a rotation government where he had to vacate the prime ministership in September of 1986, after 2 years in office. Peres told Hussein, if you sign peace with me, I'm willing to break the government. I know I'll be accused for being deceitful, for having planned it in advance, not wishing to fulfill my promise, but I will do it if you sign peace with me. And Hussein told him, no, it's the other way around. If you show me that you're serious enough and willing to break the government, I will sign peace with you. So Peres was afraid. Shamir became prime minister, and only then, as foreign minister, did Peres go to London for this agreement. Now, the Arab world, I'm sorry I have to speak for it, but Elias will, or others will correct me. In the Arab world, as well as in other places, only number one counts. When President Mubarak was in office, there were Israeli defense ministers like Fuad Ben Eliezer or Itzik Mordechai and others who believed, or Ezra Weizmann earlier, who believed that they can find some rapprochement with the Egyptian regime. They were always told, we are dealing with number one, not with the leader of the opposition, not with number two, only with those who can deliver. Peres, as foreign minister, could not deliver, and therefore it was moot, this London agreement. But going back to your position, many Israelis, in short, the last, one should always start one speech by saying, to sum up, and then go, because it's always the longest part.
So don't sum up, just be short.
In short, if the Palestinian leadership is innovative enough, creative enough to convince the Israeli public that it is sincere in its willingness to sign peace with Israel, close the accounts, no more conflict, no hidden clauses, not saying, yes, I'm willing to give up my right to go back to my home in Ramleh, but my grandchild may one day reopen the case. If there is a feeling on the part of the Israeli public at large, I'm not talking about the leadership only, not only the political elite, not even journalists, but the men in the street.
It's a Sadat precedent.
But even after Sadat came to Israel, there was a bitter struggle, first of all on the terms of the agreement, not only during Camp David, but even after that, after Carter came over.
No, I'm talking about winning the hearts and minds of the Israelis.
But you know what they said in Vietnam on this hearts and minds problem. If you get them by their balls, their hearts and minds will follow.
Okay.
But this only applies to one half of the population.
I'm not sure it's appreciated by the other one. Walton, of course.
First of all, you interchanged the term Judean Sumerian occupied territory. So for the purpose of this discussion, let us agree to say disputed territories. I think that would be,
Okay.
I think that would be much
I can't disagree. I'm not agreeing, but I'm not disagreeing. Okay, going on. No, fine, I'm just going.
Okay. Now, your bottom line, of course, is giving away some of the territory. Now, assuming we do that, and one of the conditions of the Prime Minister is disarmed area.
Demilitarized, yeah.
Demilitarized. How long do you think such an area would remain demilitarized? Because if they are a sovereign entity, a sovereign state, they should be allowed to do what they like. Now, I want to bring you back to my youth, when there was a demilitarized area in the Rhineland.
Okay.
You remember that. How long did that last?
20 years. Less than 1936. Okay.
And the moment that Hitler came to power, he said no more, and I stood in the streets of my town and I saw them marching in. So and isn't that going to be?
That's a very good question.
Isn't that going to be the same case with the
Okay,
Palestinians. And then of course we're lumbered. Once you start that, that's the thin end of the wedge.
Okay, I think the comparison is not so relevant, because first of all you must have a superior military power willing to enforce it, and the other side, the weaker party, not Germany of the 1930s,
Was weak.
but Palestine of 100 years later. Palestine must have a lot to lose for doing that. Now, of course, you must have an enforcement mechanism, and you can't have the Palestinian entity, no matter what you call it, you can't have them get either a strong army of their own or sign military pacts which will let the Iraqis or the Iranians or whoever.
He says, how can you could
can't
guarantee
stop
that?
it.
How you can
First of all,
guarantee it?
you must have an interest on their part not to do it. You can never guarantee anything in life. Israel, the paradox here is that when Arafat came in, Israel wanted him to be strong enough to fight Hamas, but weak enough not to fight it. It's a very delicate balance. You must have a strong police force. This is even the Camp David Accord, a strong police force, but you don't want them to have an armored force, an air force, or cyber now. You have electronic problems. But Walter, please, I have to give Oded
you have. I
just
insist.
the opportunity to agree with me.
In a second, Oded.
So thank you for the opportunity of agreeing with Amir, because I agree with, I think the majority of the
Not
population
again.
of the state of Israel would sign a peace agreement. Okay, if it would have been something genuine that the Israeli population would believe that it's going to hold water, the Israeli population will be willing to take risks. It's been proven in the past, and the country was split. But as we govern ourselves in a democratic society, the majority decided, and the hard decisions were taken. I think the main problem that arises from what Amir said is the fact that we're discussing it with ourselves. We are drawing maps, we're drawing plans, we're saying what we're going to agree on, and Elias might be very generous here in saying I'm agreeing on that, but we know that we had quite a few examples. Ehud Olmert, Ehud Barak, trying to draw those maps, trying to make those concessions, trying to take those military risks just in order to deliver, and there was nobody on the other side to deliver. Now, I'm not just going to say that the Palestinians are the only ones to be blamed. I think after the issue of how Amona was dealt, we're also starting to have a problem in Israel that we don't have leaders to deliver. And if Amir said in the past that the Arab leaders wanted to speak with number one, I have doubt how much they are going to trust in number one in Israel today. And it doesn't matter today if it's Netanyahu and tomorrow it's going to be somebody else, because our leaders today, with the build-up of the coalitions, the minorities are pulling us much further away than what Amir said about the mainstream, and that's the reality in which we're living.
Okay, yes, please. Okay, we'll get back to you, Walter. Yes, please.
Going back to resolution 2334, how do you expect it to influence the events of next week? On Sunday, the Paris conference, and maybe another speech from the Obama government.
You want me to answer?
Question to both of you.
The Palestinian effort has historically been to get international recognition, because as the weaker party in the conflict, they want some balance by having an outside force supporting them. The question is it really worth it? What is the actual measure of this support? So you have a declaration, you have a non-binding resolution, you don't have sanctions. What do you do with it? First of all, it has some value because a relative moderate like Abu Mazen can come to his population and tell them, you see, I have some achievement. Through diplomacy, I got more than what the resistance, of course he doesn't call it terror, what the resistance achieved by committing acts of violence. So bear with me, always my successors. This is the right road to get our national aims. And I wouldn't sell this approach short. This is This is a very important point in the inter-Palestinian debate. The other thing is, each successive American administration, as well as other Western regimes, builds on the shoulders of its predecessors. So, as Oded mentioned earlier, some people in Israel, or especially in the settlements, were sore at President Obama for doing what he did during the transition period. President Reagan did the same when he was handing over to President Bush. He waited until November, a week after the elections, and he started the dialogue with Arafat at Algiers, along with the Palestinian national covenant being changed. So it is important to have a marker to say, okay, from now on, this is our point of reference. Whether the Paris conference does anything which will be binding or not is less important, because the entire ground in the region is shifting. We don't know what will be the new alignment between Trump and Putin and Erdogan and Khamenei and who knows who else. Will Bashar Assad stay as he is now? Will Syria go back to being an important player after being seemingly ruined? We must wait and see. But it is important that there is an arrow pointing towards a diplomatic solution of this conflict.
Oded.
If I want to take something from Amir's answer, is we need to wait. It's too early to determine. We can't decide whether we're going for a two-state or for one state. We need to wait and determine and see who are the players in the region and what are the international forces who are going to be involved. We don't know how Europe is going to look tomorrow. We don't know what's going to be the results of the elections in France. They're holding a convention, but they've got internal problems. I read the map differently. I think if Abu Mazen brings a resolution from Paris, like they brought a resolution from the United Nations, it's already too little to answer the questions that he needs to answer at home. People are getting fed up. People are getting frustrated. People are losing their trust. I know more and more Palestinians saying, we don't want our democracy, we want to become part of your democracy, shifting the burden to our shift, whether they want a one-state or a two-state. But all these issues, at the end of the day, are issues which can't be ignored. And to hold one resolution, I think it achieves the exact opposite, because at the end of the day, it shows that the Palestinian side are doing acts by themselves, one-sided acts. They're trying to influence Israel from the outside, which at the end of the day brings more fear and more aggravation within the Israeli population. Oh, if they're doing things by themselves, one-sided, so you know what, let us lay the annexation bill. Whether it makes sense or not, whether it's going to be according to international law, we're going to be criticized, people have stopped thinking about that. And you see the reactions of the Israeli politicians, which you fail to understand what's the logic behind it. The only explanation I have is a reaction to what they see happening by the Palestinians. So they say, you know what, we'll do the same on our side.
I'd like to take issue with something, not which Oded said, but which I said earlier. And yes, because I disagree with myself, and myself is usually right, but sometimes
This
I
is
am.
proper democracy.
How can we know?
Yeah.
So
Now-
you journalists change your views or
Well,
opinions?
Depends who pays. Depends who pays.
Yeah, no, that's how I get paid double for my efforts. Yes, there is a successive policy in most cases, but there are events which can change the linear progression to some unexpected direction. And we know about September 11 and the Trump election and other Brexit, other events which seemingly came out of nowhere and changed our outlook. One such possibility, and all it has to take, is a new Palestinian leader and a new willingness on the Palestinian population to behave differently than they did up to now, is here in Jerusalem. Why do the 300 or so thousand Palestinians who are Israeli subjects, Israeli nationals, they are not citizens, they cannot vote in the Knesset, but they can vote in the municipality. They can elect a mayor. They don't do it because this would reflect recognition of Israeli sovereignty and all of that. But if tactically a Palestinian leader, backed by a broad consensus of other leaders, would say, listen guys, we don't have to recognize them. Let's surprise them. The next time there are elections to mayor of Jerusalem, let's put a list of our own, let's elect the mayor and show Israeli Jews what happens when you annex so many Palestinians. Is this is what you want to happen in the Israeli elections for the Knesset? Because
Remember,
this,
if it happens, it started here. Okay?
so up to now we are complacent because it never took place. But what if it did?
George,
Very interesting.
we are wrapping up.
I'm wrapping up. I want to go to really to the people who are really experiencing the real life of the settlements and the reaction to the Palestinians who come and have a relationship with you. Are you prepared as a mayor to think of yourself in the future as David Rotem told me 4 years ago, 5 years ago in London, that my proposal that we create two states with two minorities in which your minority presence in Palestinian state would be considered as strong as our minority, the Palestinian minority on the Israeli side. And it was a fascinating discussion because there was a sense that we might be moving in this direction as the door to the question that you raised at the beginning. You're looking for a way forward. I think the Palestinians need to know today, is the state of Israel ready to consider this possibility that both states would have their minorities in the future?
I think at the end of the day, it's a very personal question. I myself would not even think twice. I would pack up and move. I have no desire to live under the Palestinian Authority. I see how they treat their citizens, and I don't want to be a subject to that type of country. That's my answer. I would add on to say that my Palestinian neighbors say the same thing. They're next to Efrat, the security fence is not completed. They're afraid that the security fence will be completed because they want to be on my side of the fence or not on that side of the fence. I don't need to explain why. Open any newspaper that is describing what's happening in different Arab countries and you will understand. What's happening today in Judea and Samaria is in a way somewhat, despite all the global movements, is somewhat a miracle that these extremist Islamic organizations have not come in yet, that the people who live there, whether they're Jews or Arabs, are enjoying this sense of security which doesn't comply in many other places around the Arab world and sometimes also in Europe. And it's definitely a challenge as to what type of Palestinian Authority and how strong will it be. But for me personally, my grandparents ran away from Europe to live in a Jewish state and not to be a subject of a Palestinian state.
Let me just remind you that in 1947, Resolution 181, which created a Jewish state and an Arab state, which did not come into being because of the invasion of the Arab armies on May 15, this is exactly what they had in mind. They had in mind an Israeli state which would have a very small Israeli majority, hundreds of thousands of Israelis, of Jews, and almost the same number of hundreds of thousands of Arabs. And on the other side, an Arab state in which there will be a huge Palestinian Arab majority, but also a small minority of Jews living under their control. And the Arabs rejected it. The Israeli leadership accepted this solution of having Israelis living under Arabs.
Okay, I want to thank you, Oded and Amir, for excellent, civilized, sometimes too civilized.
We apologize.
You put something in our water. I don't know what it
I want
was.
to thank you for coming, and thank you very much.
Thank you.